You know, when I think about next week, the anniversary of September the 11th, we are now going to be celebrating another, or not celebrating, but, remembering another 9/11 tragedy. And that is what happened in Benghazi, where we left 4 Americans out to die. And when I think about the fact that I've been on the front lines in my 22 years in the United States military, we have members of the State Department that are right there side by side with us in many of these foreign lands and many of these combat zones. And we cannot continue to have administrations, we cannot continue to have civilian leadership that does not protect our men and women that we send out to protect us. So joining me right now is Samuel Katz, who along with Fred Burton, wrote the book Under Fire, The Untold Story of What Happened in Benghazi, Libya. And it's a sad thing that we have to get it from a book because we could not get it from the administration or out of congressional hearings. Sam, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
First of all, the 5 agents that were there in the consulate in Benghazi, how are they doing?
4 of them have returned to active duty, a few have returned to assignments in the Middle East, and 1 is still recovering from his wounds.
Why do you think it is that we have never been able to, get to the truth, get to the bottom of what happened, never get an opportunity to talk to the 30 to 35 survivors that were there, and definitely not the Department of State security personnel?
Well, you've asked an amazing question that hasn't been answered, and I think it hasn't been answered for a number of reasons. And there are 2 different worlds that we're dealing with. We're dealing with, one is the world of the State Department Diplomatic Security Service, that immediately following this tragedy, it found itself targeted for blame for the incident. I was asked in promoting the book, who's to blame, who in the administration is to blame. And the reality is the terrorists are to blame for the attack. They're the perpetrators. And the agents were doing their duty bravely, with incredible courage. And that's one of the focal points of the book, is the heroism they displayed. But the State Department, especially in how it handles its diplomatic security service, is very wary of giving them the spotlight and letting them tell their story.
Yes.
They also don't give them a seat at the table. When the State Department decides that they will open a new embassy somewhere, or reopen an embassy that was closed because of war or some other dangers, just as the U.S. Embassy in Mogadishu that was reopened last week, the security personnel, the professionals, the people with years and years of experience on the ground, are not sitting at the table making those decisions. They get their orders, and they say, you send people to do it, and however you have to do it with the resources at your availability, go ahead and do it. So on one regard, the State Department and its security arm usually work on separate tracks, which is one of the things recently, just yesterday, the New York Times revealed that there was a panel that was convened with suggestions made up of former State Department agents, how this can be fixed. And one of their suggestions was that diplomatic security go from a small office underneath the management umbrella in state and become its own entity, where they can have power, they can make their own decisions, and security can drive the train as opposed to always having to catch up.
When I think about this situation, and 10 years ago I was in Iraq commanding a battalion, how is it that we had Islamist militia groups engaged in providing security for an ambassador? And one of the things that I always knew when we were in a combat zone, you didn't move around high-value target personnel on September 11th. So the first question for me is, why was Ambassador Stevens in the hotbed of radical Islamism, which Benghazi was, where they had black al-Qaeda flags flying all over the place?
That's a great question, and I wish I had the answer for you. But for whatever reason, Ambassador Stevens had on his itinerary to be in Benghazi that week. He had meetings scheduled. Some of his itinerary was uncovered in the wreckage and the destruction of the consulate in Benghazi, and was later revealed and became open material for people to see who his meetings were with. But and in fact, some of his meetings were open events, public events, the work that ambassadors do. Benghazi was a hotbed. Eastern Libya was a hotbed.
Absolutely.
There was a city nearby called Derna that for years was the epicenter of Islamic fundamentalism in Libya. And Gaddafi himself tried to subdue them and failed. Many of the residents of Derna were noted fighters in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I'm sure that today there are noted members from residents of Derna who are now fighting in Syria. So these events were known. In June 2012, the CIA assassinated the number 2 of Al-Qaeda, who happened to be Libyan. Al-Qaeda in North Africa swore vengeance. They swore that they would take, they would assassinate or take some sort of retribution against the United States. A few days later, the British ambassador to Libya, to Libya, but he was in Benghazi, was targeted for assassination. Miraculously, he survived an RPG attack. Other Western interests were attacked. Even the Iranians who were involved with the International Red Crescent picked up and left. They pulled chalks and departed the city. But for whatever reason, the United States remained behind. In the book, we speak to a former State Department agent who was a young rookie agent, was sent to Beirut in 1975 during the Civil War. The embassy was constantly receiving artillery fire. There were snipers all around. And he sent a cable back to Washington and said, I'm concerned. We don't have the personnel or the means to secure the embassy. We should pull out. And a few days later, the State Department sent back a cable and said, we're in Lebanon for a higher purpose. And a few days later, the U.S. ambassador and the chief political officer were kidnapped by Palestinian terrorists and assassinated.
I remember that very well. And that was Hezbollah.
No, that was a Palestinian terrorist group.
Okay.
But the higher purpose of diplomacy, the higher purpose of America's strategic interests, sometimes trump security requirements and common sense.
But see, I cannot understand it. Nothing should trump security requirements. So, when I understand that, Gregory Hicks got the phone call with the words, we're under attack, that should have set in place certain security protocols, if I'm correct, to make sure that the proper resources were there. In your book, did you really uncover that those proper security protocols were not followed?
There were no protocols that weren't followed. But as you know from your time in the military, sometimes when things happen, things slow down. I always use the analogy that Tim McCarver uses when calling a baseball game, that speed slows down the game. When there's a terrorist incident, everything kind of grinds to a halt, and they figure out what's the best response, what's the safest response, how do we get everybody there, what resources will bring them there. And immediacy in terms of reacting to terrorism isn't immediate at all. It could be 12 hours, could be 24 hours. It's we mentioned in the book, State Department agents always joke that being a beat cop, if you find yourself in trouble, you call for backup. Backup can be a block away or half a mile away. If you're a State Department agent in a volatile post somewhere in the middle of North Africa, relief can be an aircraft carrier 6,000 miles away, and you have to hold out. And traditionally, the State Department Diplomatic Security Service agents have been brilliant in being innovative, in being resourceful, being personable, and using whatever local resources were at their disposal to assist in safeguarding an embassy or consulate they were in charge of. But Libya was void of any host government, any normal police force. Libya was basically chaotic. There were individuals driving in pickup trucks with anti-aircraft cannons riding around with
the technicals.
Yes. In Benghazi, there were parades frequently on Friday in which all the militiamen would parade in their combat outfits and wave flags and chant. It was lawless. It was the entire northern part of Africa was embroiled in an Arab Spring that had veered way out of control.
But if that was the atmosphere, and if we knew that, I'm sure there were cables that were going around that was talking about Al-Qaeda and Maghreb upset about the assassination of their number 2 guy, why didn't we, respond appropriately? Why didn't we prepare appropriately if we knew that the British ambassador had been attacked, if we knew that even the Iranians, the Red Crescent and the Red Cross had pulled out, and you have this open schedule, then why would we not want to ensure that the ambassador had the right amount of protection? I mean, at least take the initiative.
Well, the agents who were on the ground did whatever they could, both during his visit and in safeguarding his meetings. But we have to, sometimes circumstances are beyond the common sense of good-hearted people. If we think of Benghazi and all these little signposts along the road, and there was an IED that was placed in front of the consulate in July of 2012. We think of the fact that on September 11th, on the morning, there were indeed protests throughout the Arab world, very violent protests. The U.S. Embassy in Cairo was surrounded by tens of thousands of protesters who wanted to set fire to the building. In Tunis, in Morocco, the same sort of demonstrations. And there was fear that embassies would be overrun. there's nothing that all the security in the world can do to stop 25,000 people that want to storm a building. And then on the night of September 11th, an attack happens, and there's confusion, there's fog of terror. The reports that the agents were issuing via cell phone were being repeated, but things get lost in transmission. There's panic. Sometimes they're not sure, and when it is received in Washington, there's also confusion. People have to be notified. It was already early evening in Washington. People had to be summoned back. So things kind of move slowly, and ultimately it's up to the agents on the ground to survive. Now, their decisions, their actions are completely their own. It's hindsight is always 20/20, but whatever decisions they would have made, they'd had to live with. And they served incredibly, with incredible courage and heroism, and they risked their lives, and they suffered.
No, I do not seek to castigate the agents on the ground in any negative light whatsoever. I just believe that there was a failure of understanding the situation, the atmosphere, 9/11, all of the indicators and warnings, as we say in the military.
But from your experience in the military, has there ever been confusion and misunderstanding?
Oh, once bullets fly, it's called the fog of war. But at least you're supposed to, I was in, like I say, combat zones in 9/11, and we thought through all types of different contingencies to try to make sure that, we had the right type of requisite security, and we knew that 9/11 was a big deal for them. And when you look at what was happening in that environment, there were all the warning signs to show that something is building up.
Absolutely. It was an intelligence failure. And the date is symbolic to the terrorists.
Absolutely.
And it should have been appreciated. But in any country, the ambassador's word is the word of God. Mm-hmm. He is the personal representative of the United States in that country.
Sure.
He's the chief of mission. He is ultimately responsible for all official Americans in country, including his own personal safety. Mm-hmm. So the decision to be there was his own. And even if the security staffers would have said it's not a good idea, if he decided to be there, they were going.
It was very interesting, of course, in the aftermath, the immediate aftermath. We heard everything about a spontaneous reaction to a video. In your research and your writing of the book, do you really think that had anything to play in it? Or, like you said, you saw this intelligence, you saw this buildup, you knew you were in bad guy country. Did we misread it?
I don't think we misread it to the point that you're indicating. I think if you think of the protests to the film, think of it almost as people wanting to rob a bank, and then there's a power outage just as they're about to drill and circumvent the alarm. It provided perfect cover.
Sure.
The demonstrations throughout North Africa provided perfect cover for what these individuals were planning. Mm-hmm. And the people inside understood that they were under surveillance. And again, Libya was a country that had just come after 42 years of being a police state, and everybody watched one another. And people were very, very wary when there was surveillance. People knew when they were being watched. And indeed, those Ambassador Stevens sent a cable the morning of, mm-hmm. saying that they were being surveilled and that he was concerned. But he did not decide to leave. He decided to carry on with his itinerary for whatever the reasons that he was there. And the security staff was there, and their job was to make sure that up until their capabilities, they could carry out their security tasks as best as possible.
I got 1 minute left. What are the lessons learned that you see from Benghazi, Libya?
The State Department did, after the 9/11 attack in Benghazi, create a post that dealt specifically with critical threat areas around the world. There's been a lot of discussion as to what needs to be done internally to give the resources to the agents, and also the power to the agents and the directors of the service, so that they can have an influence in telling the diplomats kind of what's safe and what's not. But as you know from your years of service, and you know from the history of the Middle East, terror, and especially terror directed against diplomats and diplomatic posts, has been something that has been going on for many, many years. And I fear, especially as involvement in the Middle East only is on the upswing, especially with talk of intervention in Syria. Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard have a very long and bloody history of targeting American diplomats and diplomatic posts.
Well, I do not want to see the new normal to be we lose more agents in the Department of State Security Service, nor ambassadors. So Sam Katz, thanks so much for joining us. His book, Under Fire, written with Fred Burton, The Untold Story of the Attack in Benghazi. It is out now for everyone to get. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, when we come back from the break, we're going to take a few more calls, and then we'll wrap up our segment for today. I'm Alan West, guest hosting on the Steve Malzberg Show.